could say.
Hmm.
If you don't, cut out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Say something came up.
All right. People are starting to join. With a few more seconds, and then we will go live. All right. Hello and welcome everybody to today's discussion. My name is Arta Moini and I'm the director here at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. IPD is a nonpartisan international affairs think tank committed to promoting and amplifying provocative, innovative thinking in North Atlantic foreign policy. We stand for dialogue, diplomacy, prudent realism, and military restraint, principles that we believe are the four cornerstones of sustainable peace in an increasingly complex and dynamic international system. This week, the world was witness to the unfolding of one of the most momentous and historic geopolitical events of the 21st century so far. Russia and Ukraine are at war. What will the Biden administration do or can and should do is obviously a question on many people's minds. Oddly, next Tuesday, President Biden will deliver his first State of the Union address. Over his first year in office, the Biden administration and President Biden himself has been called everything from an appeaser to a realist to a liberal internationalist over his administration's foreign policy. With the conflict in Ukraine boiling over, foreign policy will no doubt feature prominently in the president's remarks. At times, US foreign policy in the past year has appeared disjointed, a series of disconnected ad hoc decisions across different strategic theaters, lacking unity or overarching strategy. But is there order and scheme to the madness? Could a Biden doctrine be crystallizing beneath the seemingly divergent and shifting priorities of the Biden national security team? And how does the Biden administration conceive of America's role in the world in a changing domestic and international political climate? Thankfully, we have with us four highly esteemed experts to help make sense of the current crisis and of the Biden administration's record. On that note, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, David Polanski, who is a research fellow here at IPD and the moderator of today's discussion. But before doing so, I want to ask Emil Doak, the executive director of the American Conservative magazine, to say a few words. TAC is a co-sponsor of today's event. Emil?
Thank you, Arta. I'll be very brief. I just wanted to hop on and say that we at the American Conservative are proud to be partnering on this event. This is something that's really core to our mission here at the American Conservative, making sure that our country's foreign policy is really marked by the national interests. As those watching the event may know, we were founded in 2002 as a rare conservative voice against the oncoming Iraq war. And in the 20 years since, advancing a foreign policy marked by realism and restraint has been a hallmark of our mission. We do that through our print magazine, through our heavily trafficked website, through conferences and events like the one that you're watching today. As Arta mentioned, I think that there's really no more important time for us to make sure that cooler heads prevail in our country's foreign policy and that we are making sure that we are advancing policies that really serve the national interests and are marked by realism and restraint. So I'm sure that our excellent panel here will unpack all of this and more today. But we're thrilled to be part of it, and I would encourage all of you, I would encourage and invite you to continue to follow this conversation at our website, theamericanconservative.com. We publish a lot on these issues. Doug McGregor, who's one of our panelists here, is our senior fellow and publishes there frequently. So anyways, thank you to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy and for all of you for joining us today. And I will turn it over here to David.
Yeah. Thank you, Emil. David, you can introduce the panelists. Go ahead.
All right. Thanks, Arda, and thanks, Emil, and thanks to our panelists, thanks to our listeners. So we're here to take, as Arda mentioned, the State of the Union approaching, a critical look back in the first year. And yes, it really has been just 1 year, apparently. Looking at the Biden administration's foreign policy, but I think we'll also be taking a look forward to what we might anticipate in the coming years. Now, I'm reliably informed that this past week has been a busy one from a geopolitical standpoint. Obviously, that will inform our discussion. I hope it won't entirely overtake it, because we do want to also take a somewhat broader look at the full scope of American foreign policy under this administration. So I'm just going to briefly introduce our panelists today before stepping back and inviting them to make some remarks of their own, after which I'll be pestering them each with questions, and then hopefully also taking some questions from any of our listeners and viewers. So I'll start with Douglas McGregor. He's a retired U.S. Army colonel. He served honorably in the first Gulf War. He's also a former government official and he was a senior advisor to the acting Secretary of Defense in the Trump administration. He's written a number of books on military strategy. Next, we have George Beebe. He is the current Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for the National Interest. He's also a former government official. He was the chief of the CIA's Russia analysis. He worked for the Vice President directly, Vice President Cheney, as well as a former State Department official. Then we have Professor Chris Fettweiss, Professor of Political Science at Tulane University. He's written a number of books on grand strategy, which I'm sure will be relevant today. And he also serves, I'm happy to say, as a senior fellow with IPD. And finally, we have Christopher Preble, who's really helpfully stepped in at right in the last minute. He is currently the co-director of the New American Engagement Initiative at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security of the Atlantic Council. And he's a former vice president for defense and foreign policy studies for many years at the Cato Institute. And prior to that, he served as a naval officer. So he's had a busy career. I am going to turn things over immediately now. I think we'll start with Douglas McGregor, who is free to tell us what he thinks.
That's always scary. Well, thanks very much. I would start very shortly, very briefly by saying that if you go back into the 1990s, I think it's probably 1992, and look carefully at a memorandum that was written in the Department of Defense by then Assistant Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz. He outlines effectively a course charted for the good ship United States, and his course involves the advocacy for global or world revolution in the Trotskyite sense in behalf of democratic liberalism or liberal democracy, and the use of American military hegemony to realize the goals of forcible democratization of the rest of the world according to that liberal democratic model. I would urge everybody to look at it because I don't see much evidence that anything has changed very much in the actual conduct of US foreign policy since he wrote that particular memorandum. Initially, Bill Clinton was not enthusiastic about it, and he was sort of dragged involuntarily into places like the Balkans and Haiti and so forth. But nevertheless, he was subjugated and dragged. Then we get George W. Bush, who was a more enthusiastic proponent for it, who worked hard to realize it. He's followed by Barack Obama, who again was very reluctant and unenthusiastic initially, but frankly didn't make much difference. He too was dragged in those directions. You just look at the histories of the interventions and activities of the time, and that's clear. Then finally, you get Donald Trump, who was always adamantly opposed, but managed to appoint people to key positions in his administration who were advocates for exactly what Paul Wolfowitz was back in the 1990s. And that brings us up to date with the current administration, who seems to have essentially adopted the same rhetoric, the same policies, the same attitudes that push us into confrontation with certain states who refuse to essentially capitulate to our demands that they adapt to this model, whether it involves international finance, politics, or anything else. So that's my view of where American foreign policy has been for the last 30 years. And I don't see very many ups. I see lots of downs. And I think it's reached entropy. But it remains to be seen that anything will change until this administration is gone.
Thanks, Douglas. George, do you want to go?
Sure. I don't disagree with what Doug has just said. I'll offer a little bit different framework for evaluating where we are. Any administration's foreign policy needs to begin, in my view, with an understanding of what America's core national interests are. Everything needs to flow from that. Now, in my opinion, there's a significant gap between the national interests that I believe are most important to the country and the national interests that American presidents have been, at least implicitly and at times explicitly, articulating as most important to the country since the early 1990s, as Doug is pointing out. My belief is that first and foremost, we have to secure the safety and survival of the country. That is our top national interest. It's protecting the country against destruction by nuclear attack, by a nuclear power, by WMD attacks, by non-government organizations, terrorists. It's preserving the ability of our democracy to function effectively and our economy to prosper. We have to begin with those core interests. Instead, I think we've begun for several decades now from the premise that the United States' most important interest in the world is spreading liberal democracy. It's transforming the world, transforming other countries so that they look like the United States or Western Europe in some way. And the belief is that that will create a hospitable international environment. It will lift all boats. Everyone will prosper at home and abroad, rooted in democratic peace theory. And to a great degree, no president that I recall, other than Donald Trump, has challenged the veracity of that belief. And I think right now we're in a situation where we are doing things to pursue that vision to varying degrees, which actually undermine those core national interests that our country has. They're making us less secure. They're making the prospect of a nuclear confrontation with a great power such as Russia or China more likely rather than less likely. We are actually fueling radicalism, a backlash against the United States, against democracy abroad, and we're causing doubts inside our own country about the effectiveness of our institutions, the trustworthiness of our leaders, and actually the viability of core American principles and values. All of that is making the country much less secure and making the world a much more dangerous place for us. And I think we're on the precipice of a new approach to the world. We have to do this because we're failing. We've spent ourselves into oblivion. And you'll recall that one of the core national interests is to make sure our economy can function effectively. If we overextend ourselves abroad, overreach, and don't appreciate the importance of a balance between the means that we have to pursue our interests in the world and the objectives that we pursue, we could fatally undermine our own economy. And I think all of these things are highly problematic, and I think all of these problems are very much present in the current administration. I would say that they didn't begin under Biden. To a great degree, I regard him as right now the chief spokesperson for the American foreign policy establishment, which has been pursuing this for several decades. It's a collective failure, and we're going to have to quite fundamentally change our approach to the world.
Thanks, George. Professor Fetmeister, you want to go?
Sure, I'll just say a couple things maybe before we start the Q&A bit. I don't disagree with my colleagues necessarily, but I do I'm not sure things are as dire as they made it out to be. I think generally speaking, the world is, compared to any other time, this week notwithstanding, it's a pretty benign security environment for the United States. We don't have a lot of major threats out there, believe it or not. I don't see a big backlash brewing against the United States, at least among non-state actors. A lot of people have been worrying about that since 9/11. We haven't seen it. I don't think anybody's, compared to, security is relative. And compared to any other country at any other time, we are safe. We're a safe country, and we don't recognize that. We don't act like that. I overall, about the Biden administration, I haven't been too terribly depressed about what they've done so far, which I usually get when it comes to American foreign policy. I tend to think the president is more has what we say realist instincts. I think he has sort of restrained instincts. We'll have to see how this crisis unfolds. I think we've done well in making it clear that we're not going to be fighting over the Ukraine, which I think there have been a lot of people suggesting we should. So I've been pleased about that. I think it's going to remain somewhat contained, but then again, I thought Putin wouldn't be stupid enough to do this. So who the hell knows what I think? I generally don't. I think that we ought to start any conversation about U.S. grand strategy by recognizing we are an incredibly safe country compared to any other country in the world. Are there problems? Are we completely safe? No, of course not. No person is safe. No country is safe. But compared to any other one at any other time, we are living in a benign world, relatively speaking. Obviously, this week shows that it's not a completely benign world, but nobody's coming over here. And we ought to keep that in mind when we talk about our vital national interests. They're not threatened, whatever happens in Central Europe, and they're not threatened by what happens in much of the Middle East. We can get along just fine. And it's a luxury that we don't often keep in mind, we don't often appreciate enough. So this week, we ought to keep that in mind that, yeah, there's some trouble spots in the world, but this isn't one of them over here. But so anyway, I'm sure we'll get in more. I can flesh out stuff as we talk.
Great, thanks. All right, Chris Breville, you're up.
Great, thanks. So the benefit or the liability of going last is that you mostly echo the things that people before you said. So I'll try to pick out a few things that I agree with and a few areas where I would disagree. I certainly agree with Doug and George that we have been embarked on a relatively consistent way on a quite ambitious foreign policy. I think Doug is right to start the counter around 1992, the end of the Cold War, after the first Gulf War. And Samuel Huntington called it primacy. Others called it a benevolent global hegemony, whatever word you want to use. The United States was not content to, as Chris points out, sort of accept our fortunate set of circumstances and try to husband our resources and maintain our safety and security. We were embarked, as George points out, on this mission, sometimes more aggressively than at other times, to spread liberal democracy on the basis of the belief that a world populated by more liberal democracies would be a more peaceful world. So I think there's a lot that's been put on the table that I agree with. I do want to echo, though, and sort of put a point of emphasis on what Chris said with respect to our fortunate circumstances. And I think this has some political salience, or at least it should, or it could, which is to say that in the past, when a U.S. leader, or really in any democratic society, or really any society, a lot of times it was customary to point to a foreign danger, to rally the public to the leadership, right? The rally around the flag effect, as it's come to be known. And American presidents were not above this, and we've seen multiple occasions in which, either deliberately or otherwise, an American president enjoyed a a bump in his popularity as a result of a foreign policy crisis. I also should point out that they don't just have to be foreign policy successes. They actually could be foreign policy failures. I actually went back to the data on this. Of course, Gallup does the regular approval ratings for the president of the United States. John F. Kennedy's high point in his presidency was not after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was seen as a success, but after the Bay of Pigs, which was seen as a failure, correctly so. Or folks like George H.W. Bush after the first Gulf War, or George W. Bush after 9/11, those were the high points of their approval rating. And again, that's their broad approval rating, not just with respect to their foreign policy. That's not the way it works anymore. And we've seen this pattern play out over the course of the last 3 presidencies, including President Biden's presidency. The high point of Barack Obama's presidency was essentially the day he was inaugurated. No incident over the course of the ensuing 8 years brought him above that level, about 69%, as I recall. Donald Trump never bumped above 50% on a broad base of approval. And again, no foreign policy successes or failures along those 4 years had any influence. And I think we're likely to see the same thing happen with respect to Joe Biden. Either successes or failures, you're not likely to see a real rallying around the flag effect. And so that, and again, we saw that play out immediately after the invasion, after Russia, after Vladimir Putin initiated the invasion of Ukraine. On Wednesday night, you had the spectacle of the former president calling into Fox News and using the occasion to allege that the current occupant of the White House was there fraudulently, falsely claiming that. So that's where we are as a society. And so I would put it back on Chris a little bit and say it is true that our foreign threats have a tendency to be exaggerated, but we have some very serious concerns and struggles right here at home. And so one of the great challenges, I think, for the Biden administration, I think President Biden has demonstrated this, is a desire to focus more attention at home and to deliberately draw down or pay a little bit less attention abroad, precisely for that reason. The United States cannot truly be strong at home unless it's strong abroad. So to me, this impulse, again, I agree with Doug and George that the impulse that President Biden reflects is sort of liberal internationalist or sort of the promotion of democracy and things like that, is nevertheless tempered by the domestic reality, which is of a polity, a bipartisan consensus of a desire to focus here closer to home. So I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Chris. Thanks a lot. So now I'm going to throw some questions away. I just want to preface this by saying that I was distressed to find out that I agreed so much with most of what you guys said. So I'm going to swing in the other direction, partly because I'm a contrarian and possibly just because I'm irritating, but I will be trying to play devil's advocate with each of you a little bit. So feel free to push back. The other thing is just, I'll direct some questions at each of you individually, but I'm really hoping that it then opens to the floor. I'd much rather see a wider discussion than just me going back and forth, which is not to say I can't talk for 90 minutes straight. I guess my first question would be for George. Actually, no. Let me go to Douglas first, because he raised something really interesting with respect to the sort of notorious Wolfowitz memo, and how, for one reason or another, different administrations since have essentially aligned with it or committed to some version of that in practice. And I'm struck by the suggestion then is that something else is happening, right? It's not a choice. It's not an ideological posture. Something is sort of directing or channeling our foreign policy and across different parties, different administrations in a certain direction. And does that sort of suggest that our foreign policy is more a matter of our standing of a certain structural situation, and that in fact it's not so much a choice? And does that also suggest that right now, if we begin to see with Biden and beyond a measure of restraint, that too is something that's been imposed upon us rather than something we're imposing upon ourselves?
Well, I think the answers to your questions are complex, but in general, your last point is accurate. Yes. I think when I mentioned entropy, I could have also said bankruptcy. And I think that's effectively where we're headed. The British Empire did not leave India until it had a debt to GDP ratio of 254%, thanks to our deliberate effort to bankrupt the British during the Second World War. As a result, they had to make some hard choices, and the first choice they made was abandon India, which heretofore had been one of the principal reasons for which they did everything up until the end of the Second World War to maintain that empire. So I think we're in a similar position, frankly. I don't know exactly when it will happen, but we're on that path. Unless, of course, you believed in the notion of modern economics that debt doesn't matter. Good luck. I think we're going to get an education here very shortly. So that's part of the answer. Secondly, you've got to follow the money in Washington, D.C. Where does the money go? Who becomes a millionaire? Who ends up moving into Great Falls and McLean and living lavishly? Who are the members of the Senate, various committees, banking and finance, defense committees, appropriators? Who are the people that become rich and powerful as a result of their service? Where does their money come from? Where are they sending their favors? How are they rewarding their donors? That's a very important question. There are a lot of answers to that, but I think it's important to also understand, to contrast that sharply with the American people, which I think has been the point of others here today, to say on any given day, the overwhelming majority of Americans, and this has been true throughout the 20th century, could care less what happens beyond the borders of the United States. And that has also been our greatest weakness. People in Washington know that most of the time, most people don't care. So what do you want to do? The first thing is you professionalize, or at least you have this thing we call a volunteer military. And the voluntary military then can be sent pretty much anywhere you want to go, because only about 1% of the population is affected by casualties that you may take. The other lesson is that if you take very few casualties, it doesn't matter if you lose 10,000 over, say, the space of 12 or 18 months, as far as Washington is concerned, but as long as you don't have too many casualties on any given day, most people aren't going to pay much attention. Remember the famous comment by George Bush II, go shopping at the mall, relax. That was the idea. In other words, continue to consume, question nothing, be sheep, be happy. We'll take care of everything for you and make you safe. And then there's the stupid idea that the more money you spend on defense, the more military capability you get. Nothing could be further from the truth. If anything is evident of that, all you have to do is look at the Russian army. Spent remarkably few dollars by our standards. They've extracted infinitely more capability. So the question is, where does the money go? Who benefits from it? And that answers a lot of your questions. And right now, one of the reasons that Donald Trump was so widely hated and despised was not simply because he was a brash, annoying, irritating New Yorker. It was also because he threatened the money flows. And whether it was Inhofe or Schumer or Markey or Cruz or anybody else, everyone has a stake in keeping the money flowing in the right directions. That's the biggest problem in Washington. So once you figure out where the money is going, obviously defense is a big part of that, but it's not the only part. Then you begin to answer the question, well, why does nothing change? Well, nothing changes because the money continues to flow. And the hope is now that we'll have a massive increase in the defense budget, which is hard to conceive of or comprehend given where we already are, on the basis of what has happened in Ukraine, which in reality, as my predecessors have pointed out, most people could care less what happens in Ukraine. I think the last polling was that only 26% of Americans polled thought we should even be involved anywhere in Eastern Europe. And if you ask on any given day in Seattle or St. Louis or San Francisco about NATO, at least half of them will look at you as though you've landed from another planet. They don't even know what it is. So here we are. We were always rich and powerful so that we could pretty much do what we wanted. We were insulated by the oceans. Then we developed a nuclear deterrent to the point where anybody who engages in a nuclear attack against us is committing suicide. So where are we? We're approaching bankruptcy. And like the British who left India, we will finally bring the troops home when it becomes necessary for reasons of bankruptcy, because the first thing everybody will cut in discretionary spending is defense. We're not going to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid before we cut defense. And that's coming.
So you raised this loops into something that I think George was talking about, which is about the economic constraints that we either ignore or we ultimately get imposed upon us. And it made me think of, there's that famous discussion, I think, in Machiavelli, where he talks about whether money is the sinews of war. And he kind of concludes it's not exactly, but of course, if you're prepared to be completely imperial about it and take whatever you want, then you can kind of reverse engineer whatever funding you need. Obviously, we're not quite prepared to go that far. So I guess my question is, what do we need to do to secure actually suggestion right now seems to be, I think we're coming up against the fact that there are real limits on our ability to conduct foreign policy. Since we've embedded so much of our supply chains elsewhere, and since we've allowed ourselves to go into so much debt and allow so many other countries to hold their currency. So are there things that we need to do first to actually secure our ability to do foreign policy, or is it simply that we need to bring back our foreign, scale back our foreign policy and wake up to reality?
Somebody else want to take that? I mean, I think I've bloviated enough.
I got it. Well, I'm not exactly sure what you mean, David, by do foreign policy. I mean, I think just because we can't necessarily get every outcome we want doesn't mean we're not going to be engaging the world. We're spending a heck of a lot, and I agree with everyone on this panel. We're spending way too much, but I don't necessarily think it's because fully explicable by the military-industrial complex and all the ins and outs. I think it's that there's a belief in this society that spending and safety are directly related. That if you spend more, you're safer. And I disagree with Doug a little bit that the notion that Trump threatened the money flow. In fact, Trump turned up the spigots and greatly increased our spending in the military because he knows that people believe in this country that the more we spend, or they think the more we spend, the safer we are. That's a totally ridiculous concept in my mind, but that belief is out there. And as long as that belief is out there, it's going to be difficult for any president to cut the military budget because people will think that we won't be able to accomplish foreign policy goals, like David was just suggesting, or that we won't be safe. And if we spend twice as much, we're twice as safe. It's idiotic, but that as long as that view is there and it's visceral in the American public, no president is going to be able to cut that budget in any significant way, to any rational degree. And so it's not so much that the arms manufacturers are tinkering with us, it's that the American public will not allow that to happen. As stupid as that sounds, and I don't know how to educate them out of it. You can talk all you want on the panels like this, that if we spend more, it's not necessarily going to be safer, but they still believe it. And it's going to be a political winner to increase the budget.
Can I disagree with my friend Chris slightly? He's certainly correct. Sorry to take it. I'm not trying to take the moderator privilege from you, David, but I saw an opening there. It's certainly true that U.S. military spending rose under Donald Trump, and he was quite proud of it. He boasted of it. But I disagree slightly with Chris that the situation is worse with respect to public support for that kind of spending. And I think if you scratch just a little bit below the surface and you sort of squint a little bit, I think there are some grounds for optimism. Why? Because the public has seen the fruits of this investment, so-called, in the military over the last quarter century, and is unimpressed. Okay, and so even before the withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of last year, even before then, a casual observer could have a general sense, and only about 10 or 15% of the American people can guess, even within $250 billion, what the Pentagon's budget is. But they have a general sense that we spend a lot. They don't know how much, but they think we spend a lot. And they look back and they say, gee, you'd think after spending all this money that we'd have a few actual military successes that we could point to that are attributable to this spending. They don't see that. There's very little evidence of that, actually. Now again, the foreign policy community or the advocates for the spending could claim, well, imagine all the horrible things that could happen were it not for the spending, and then so you get into a counterfactual and you can argue all day long how many angels on the head of the pin. But I think that a critical factor occurred in August of 2021 when the public who wasn't paying attention, as Doug points out, all of them saw the chaos of Afghanistan. They saw it. And we knew, those of us who were paying attention before, we knew that there was a huge gap between what the senior leadership, both military and civilian, were saying about the war in Afghanistan, and what the enlisted folks and the junior officers and mid-grade officers, they knew the reality that the war was not going well. And what you've seen, therefore, is a real breakdown in trust in this institution, the institution of the U.S. military, tragically. But it is clear to see, just last week, Pew Survey does a routine every 6 months or so. They do a survey on respect for institutions. And the headline on this poll noted the decline in trust in the medical community and science as a result of sort of backlash to the COVID restrictions and the deal with the pandemic. But notably, the decline in trust in the military was just as sharp. Now, it's still the most respected, or one of the most respected institutions in the world, in the country, but it has suffered a notable decline in public trust. And I think you have to attribute that to the combination of sort of the accumulation of data over 25 years of all this spending and little to show for it, and the shock of the collapse of the Afghan government after 20 years of spending to supposedly create a sustainable and stable government, which obviously was not going on at all in Afghanistan.
If I could follow up very briefly here after the last two sets of comments, because I happen to think both have many valid points. Chris is spot on, and all you have to do is travel around the United States and you find out very quickly that for the first time in perhaps decades, Americans distinguish between general officers and admirals and common soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. There's enthusiasm for their men in uniform. There isn't much enthusiasm for the people at the top, because they're seen as having lied repeatedly and as being incompetent. So I think that's true. The other thing is, I would ask you to go back and look at the last year that Trump was in office and the comments that he makes publicly when he talks about people in the Pentagon, in the defense industries, on the Hill, and their determination to spend money to pursue warfare in places that don't count in his estimation and are wasteful. The problem of Donald Trump is a microcosm of the problem we have with presidents in general. Very few presidents come to the office with any real understanding of foreign policy or defense. The last person we had who really had a grip on these things was probably Eisenhower. Everybody else comes in there with an understanding of how to get elected in domestic politics. That they understand very well. They have some understanding of economics and business in terms of what it takes to get elected. But beyond that, there is no real foundational understanding of defense and foreign policy. So that's why we've had these national security advisors come in with the idea of tutoring people to help them understand things better. That's been an abysmal failure and a disaster in my judgment. But that's the Trump problem in that sense is not new. That's an old one. At least he figured it out at some point.
David, a quick comment on this. I agree fundamentally with the notion that the American people have a different perspective on these issues. They assign a different level of importance to them, not as enthusiastic about the grand liberalizing mission that the United States has undertaken in the world over the past several decades. Now, you can look at that and draw encouragement and say, aha, the center of gravity of the American people will act as a counterweight on the elites and restrain what they try to do in the world. I don't think that's actually been happening, however. What I'm seeing happening is a fundamental disconnect between the rulers and the ruled in this country. And I regard that actually as a dangerous thing. The gap isn't narrowing, it's expanding. The trust is not increasing, it's decreasing. And if you were to ask the average American, and I haven't done this, so I don't know, I'm speculating, but if you were to ask them, hey, do you think we ought to risk escalation into a war with Russia that could go nuclear in order to protect the principle that a country that we never intend to bring into NATO has the right to ask? I doubt that they would say absolutely yes. Absolutely, yes. And yet that's what we've done. And you have to ask yourself the question, why? Why was it that the only candidate in 2016 that stood up on the podium and said, you know what, the Iraq War was wrong, shouldn't have done it? He's the only guy that did it in either party, and he was the guy that got elected. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Joe Biden said, as part of his campaign in 2020, we do need to end these endless wars, and we do need to have a foreign policy for the middle class. He hasn't translated that rhetoric effectively into policy so far, with the exception of the Afghan withdrawal, which I think was the right decision, not particularly well executed. But other than that, we still have not reconciled what we're doing in the world and what we're trying to do in the world with the fundamental interests of the American people. And I think that's actually a dangerous situation.
So, I mean, now it sounds like you're all kind of agreeing with each other, which is unfortunate. But what I'm basically, what it reminds me of is it's a very common realist lament, right? Why do we keep doing stupid things? Besides the fact that we can. And, the Washington Post columnist Dan Dresner, many years ago now, had an interesting article like this. And he was basically saying, look, the American people support a more realist foreign policy. So what are you waiting for? What is holding you back? And I think his implication was that it's really a rhetorical problem. That is, at some point, you have to actually play politics and use the bully pulpit and work to create a coalition that actually supports this. But so I guess the question is there a popular support that is simply not being rallied because this is a failure of rhetoric on the part of the administrations that might be sympathetic, or is there a larger institutional problem? That is that whatever the administration comes in thinking, there is a bureaucratic policymaking apparatus that always seems to stymie an attempt to create a foreign policy that is more geared toward a simpler security-based national interest.
Well, has anybody here read Congressman Buck's book, The Swamp is Deeper Than You Think? The reason I ask that is the congressman from Colorado explains in great detail what he experienced when he first took office and served in the Congress, and all of the requirements that are given to him for money that he has to provide to the respective parties' national committee and so forth, as well as his own reelection campaign fund. And when he looks at the people explaining all of this to him, he says, I don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that. And they point to a building behind the Congress, which is known for its lobbyists. That's where you go to get your money. If you don't go over there and get your money, then you're not going to sit on a committee that matters. You'll never hold a position of importance. You will have no influence here on the Hill. I think there's a simple word. It's called corruption. It's real. It's enormous inside Washington. When you have to in order to get an appointment with a senator that's important to your interests, and you have to pay $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 to get through the door, we're in a lot of trouble. Now, that's not new. It just seems to be worse at this particular point in our history than perhaps any time before, and more opportunities for self-enrichment like that. The famous statement you hear over and over and over again on the Hill is, voters don't get you elected, donors do. Well, if that's how you feel, and that's what you've got to do to get elected, the whole system is rotten to the core. So maybe what you're talking about, Brother Polanski, is overhauling the entire political apparatus, which may not be a bad idea, since it's pretty much unchanged for the last 400 years, because contrary to popular belief, when we wrote the Constitution, all they did was essentially codify what already existed in the 13 colonies. All those institutions were out there. There was nothing invented in Philadelphia. So that's where we sit. We have a huge problem. Everything is badly in need of overhaul. All the great institutions in the military are all obsolete. They went obsolete years ago. They've reached block obsolescence. Perhaps the way of governing ourselves has reached some form of block obsolescence.
Well, a lot of that, though, would be a lot of that swamp is the legislative branch. I think a lot of that money makes more difference in Congress than it does, say, in the halls of the State Department, which doesn't mean it's going to get better. I agree with everything you said, Doug, but And restrainers, like especially Chris has made the point for 20 years that the public is more restrained in its preferences than our government is. But it's always been my view that the public, the number one thing correlated with foreign policy attitudes is partisanship. People get their cues from their political leaders and they follow. If you're a fan of Trump, then you think Trump's policy was right. If you're a fan of Obama, you think Obama was doing the right thing. And change doesn't necessarily have to be too difficult. If we get people in office that have a more and trusted by their political followers that have a more restrained approach, you can get a more restrained policy, and the public will go along with it. The public, as my colleagues have, many of them have said, they don't care so much about what's going on in foreign policy, but they have their leaders that they trust. Our views are correlated almost completely with partisanship.
Well, the only thing I would say, not necessarily in rebuttal to that, is just that if you look at the people who are appointed in all of these administrations, where do they come from? Who are they? How do they get appointed? Blinken hasn't said anything that Pompeo didn't say.
Well,
all right.
No.
Now you may think they're different. Good luck. The outcome is the same. And when you go to the Defense Department, you see the same nonsense. I've been going over there for years talking to people. Oh, well, you have to understand that those kinds of changes are just too difficult. We can't afford that. And well, you know, Senator Inhofe won't like that, and Senator Reid won't like that. That's how the hell you get there. So you're not getting anybody who's going to do a damn thing that makes any sense. It's back to the question. Where do we go from here? I know that 1789 happened when the people of Paris could not afford to buy bread. That seems to have been a big issue then. What happens in this country? When will it happen? I don't know. But people in Washington live in a bubble. They think the future is going to look like the past and nothing will ever change. They're very linear in their thinking. I think the nation is changing. It's already changed.
Quick comment on this. One of the reasons why I think the United States continues to engage in these, what I regard as unsuccessful and self-defeating behaviors abroad, is because we have an enormous national security apparatus that has exploded in its dimensions over the past several decades. And it has to do something. These are people who are occupying positions that call for them to do things. You know, if you look at the Washington industry focused on changing other countries, helping them develop, helping them liberalize, it's an enormous group of people. What are they going to do if the U.S. government says, you know, we're not in that business anymore? It hasn't worked too well. You know, we can point to the number of successes on one hand. What do they do? We've got an enormous counter-terrorist bureaucracy whose job it is to find them and to do bad things to them. What do we tell them if we say, gee, that hasn't worked out so well? We seem to be creating as many terrorists as we're eliminating. We need to take a different approach. There are enormous vested interests in this, an enormous amount of money at stake, and a whole bunch of jobs, you know, that are threatened if we were to say we need a different approach. So that's one reaction to all this. I would also say that if we're really going to focus on domestic healing, which I think the United States is badly in need of, I think we need to take an approach to the world very similar to what Nixon and Kissinger did in the late 1960s and early 1970s. When they were facing a situation where we had domestic trauma, domestic turmoil, we were overextended in a very unsuccessful and counterproductive war in Vietnam, which was also exacerbating our domestic problems. We faced the rise of a Soviet peer that had reached parity in its nuclear arsenal and was threatening to go well beyond that into nuclear superiority against the United States, as well as what looked to be a quite formidable international communist movement. And the approach that I think we need to undertake now is similar to what Nixon and Kissinger did, where they said, okay, let's take advantage of frictions between the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. which will make our international geopolitical challenge more manageable. Let's pursue détente with the Soviet Union. Let's end that war abroad. And the purpose of all of these things really was to get some breathing space abroad that would allow us to focus on healing internally. And although the circumstances that we're facing in the world are different, the circumstances at home are slightly different than the 1960s in the United States, the fundamental challenge I think we face is similar. How can we stabilize the external environment so that we can focus on healing internally? And I don't see that at all is the animating purpose of the way we're approaching the world right now.
So can I play I want to play devil's advocate or something more like, Carl Schmitt here. We do want to, I would agree that securing a more, Pacific domestic front is highly desirable for a number of reasons. But could it not be the case that actually the best route toward that is a more hostile foreign environment? And that part of what has in the past managed to kind of keep our partisan and political disputes, keep a lid on them to some degree, is a recognition of a common enemy.
Let me take that, David, because I sort of teed it up earlier. And I think that there are still some who believe that what the United States needs more than ever is a common objective, and that common objective be a foreign threat. Let's not forget that on the occasion of 9/11, I mentioned that was the high point of close to the high point of George W. Bush's presidency in terms of his approval. But before then, of course, he was a mistrusted figure, and of course had been elected in a very, very close election. And the country was quite divided in 2001 before September 11th, and you saw the way that the country rallied behind it. I just don't think that it's going to play out the same way if, for example, China is the big boogeyman, or Putin's Russia, and Putin given many reasons for that over the last 48 hours, or, pick your foreign threat. I think that we have witnessed just in the last few months that an attempt to unite the public around a foreign threat is in fact more likely to inflame the partisan tensions that already exist. And so, look, I think you're right. It is certainly true that, and again, not just in democratic societies, Madison and the founders, all due respect to Doug, I think the founders had a few things right. And one of the things they anticipated, one of the reasons why they put foreign policy in the hands of the Congress and not in the hands of the executive, was precisely because they recognized the tendency of executives in the past to excite a foreign danger to rally this public. I just don't think it's going to have the same effect this time around. I think, if anything, it's going to create additional fissures here in the United States, as it has.
I suppose we are probably obliged to pivot. We've been talking a bit about at the 36,000 feet up level. We're probably obliged to pivot a little bit to what's happening in the world right now. I would invite all of you actually to comment a little bit on your evaluation, your assessment of how the Biden administration has dealt with the kind of slow rolling Ukraine-Russia crisis, both since it took office and over the past year, as we've seen increased signals from Putin, but then also, of course, how you think are doing within the past 3 weeks up to today.
Well, maybe I could just kick us off with something I read this morning, which I've been looking a lot at the Chinese reaction to what's going on, trying to figuring out that what they end up saying over the course of the next few months is going to be pretty darn important. They've been pretty much mildly with Putin so far, but there's a great article in the New York Times this morning about this very issue. And it was talking about how the Biden administration had been meeting with Chinese officials over the course of the last couple of months, trying to get them on board with the condemnation of the Russians and sharing intelligence with them. Intelligence that apparently got shared right with the Russians. But that's the kind of sign that I think they've been doing pretty well. overall, I think the administration has made it clear that we're not going to war with the Ukrainians, over Ukraine, I mean, and that we've been laying out. We could have done better, in my view, making it clear that Ukraine is no business in NATO. I don't know why we didn't put that on the table. But if you want to avoid the main concern I have is at times like this, when foreign policy decisions are made based on emotion, then that usually ends in disaster. And I think for what I've seen, they've been able to avoid that, at least catastrophic blunder so far. So that's like to lead it off. I'm sure everyone has lots of views on this, but I'll lead it off with that comment.
Yeah, I'll go ahead, George. You go next.
Okay. If our goal was to prevent a major war in Europe over this, we obviously have failed. And I think the reason why we failed fundamentally is that we didn't put those core national interests first in deciding how we're going to handle this situation. As far as I can tell, the most important goal that we have pursued in the past several months leading up to the invasion of Ukraine was to preserve Allied unity. Above all else, we must maintain NATO unity. And we looked at what Putin was threatening to do in Ukraine, first and foremost, as a threat to the alliance, which we believed needed to be countered at any cost, including at the cost of a major war in Ukraine, which will, devastate the Ukrainian people, potentially wipe that country off the map, and fundamentally change Europe and the broader global order. Now, to me, this is a strategic disaster as well as a humanitarian disaster. And we've completely mishandled it. That is not to say that Putin is not primarily to blame for all this. Absolutely, he is. But our handling of this, I think, was quite inept.
I disagree to an extent. I think certainly the fault for the invasion of Ukraine is Vladimir Putin's, and increasingly you can say him and almost him alone. That spectacle of his national security meeting in the Great Hall as his cabinet officials squirmed because they didn't remember the lines that they were supposed to recite from that carefully scripted, ridiculous, absurd event. I think we have to remember who is to blame for this. By the same token, I think that opportunities there were opportunities for Vladimir Putin to take off ramps to this. He chose not to take those off ramps. They were there even up until the decision to invade, and he chose not to take advantage of those. So the one thing I will say, and I think here President Biden deserves real credit for now, see how it plays out, is I do think he took account of core national interest, George, with respect to the use of force by the United States. He has been crystal clear on this point from the beginning. The United States of America will not send troops to fight in Ukraine because it is not a core national interest of the United States. That's almost exactly what he said. And he has said it more than once. I can certainly imagine in this entire discussion, we've talked about how the bipartisan foreign policy consensus, the elite has separated from the American people. They believe certain things. And I can imagine a dozen, 24, more than that, other people in that same position who would not have said the same thing that Joe Biden did with respect to putting troops in Ukraine. Now, this may all change tomorrow. It might. But so far, his determination to prevent the United States from becoming directly involved in this conflict, I think, is notable, and we have to explain it. One of the reasons I think I've come up with to explain it is ponder this. Again, we know that Joe Biden was one of the leading opponents of the surge in Afghanistan in 2009 within the Obama administration. And he had real skepticism of that war. And so when he had the opportunity to end it, he did. But he's also, think about this, the last American president to know what it is like to have a son or now daughter serving in a war zone. The last American president to know what that's like was Dwight Eisenhower. He knows Joe Biden is appreciative of the costs of these conflicts. And even though his son, Bo, didn't die in Iraq, he knows what it's like. He knows the risks in a way that a lot of his, none of his predecessors going back to Eisenhower know. So I think he is aware of the risks. And I think he has drawn a clear line, George, based on his interpretation of core national interest, to his credit.
Well, let me just respond quickly to that. Absolutely the right call not to commit US forces to fight against the Russians in Ukraine. I fully support that. However, there are some things that must flow from that position. One of which is not that we are still going to insist that the NATO alliance be on Russia's borders. What we're effectively saying is that we believe that NATO has some sort of magic talisman, that the mere declaration that a country is inside NATO is sufficient to prevent any country from challenging NATO militarily. We don't actually have to be ready to go to war. We can be secure that that paper, that Article 5 wording by itself is sufficient to deter anyone. That's an extremely dangerous assumption to make. And we are right on the brink of somebody challenging it. If the Baltic states believe that they can resupply NATO, the Ukrainian resistance against the Russian military with impunity, safe in the knowledge that Russia would never do anything to interfere in that resupply effort, I think we're actually running some very dangerous risks. And if the Russians were to say, hey, this is not okay, you continue it, we will strike, and we continue it anyway, we could find ourselves eyeball to eyeball, to use the old Cuban Missile Crisis phrase. And the decision that we have then is, are we in fact going to go to war with the Russians? Or are we going to back down in a humiliating fashion? That's not the kind of decision that the United States president should be facing. So there needs to be a reconciliation between the positions that we're taking in the world and what kind of resources we're really willing to employ to back those up. And right now I see a dangerous gap between those things.
These are all good points. But given that if Ukraine is not going to really be the line that we were sort of pretending that it was, and hopefully it will not be that line, is there a line somewhere in Europe where that one of these administrations is going to have to commit to? And if so, do we still have the wherewithal to actually coordinate, the allies within NATO into some sort of agreement that they're, yes, this is what we're prepared to stand for, and this is what we're not. There have to be limits at some point. But are we actually prepared to even have that sort of, frankly, hard-nosed conversation about what falls in and what falls out with the with our notional allies? Not to mention Russia itself.
Perhaps I could say something about that. I've thought for a long time that NATO was dead man walking. I felt that way when I was serving in it all through the 90s. There is no cohesion. There is no universal agreement on much of anything. Everyone is in it for different reasons. So it's a simple fact that holding an alliance together in war is difficult. In peacetime, it's almost impossible. And as you know, Lugar and his friends on the Hill started talking almost immediately about, we've got to find something for NATO to do, it or we'll go out of business. And at the time, I and many of my peers in the European armies, as well as in my own, felt you probably ought to go out of business, because the thing was formed with a very specific purpose. Its raison d'etre was to defend against and, if necessary, defeat the Soviet Union. Everybody wants to keep this thing going. And so we've been giving this heart patient everything but heart treatment. We give it a haircut and a shave, but it needs a heart transplant. It's not going to happen. So I don't think anything's going to happen. I think this whole thing in Ukraine is grossly overblown. I think European states that border Ukraine will certainly show you that in the near future. The Russians are going to ship their gas and people are going to buy it. The harsh sanctions, including the SWIFT sanctions, already being rejected by Berlin. And quite frankly, whatever Berlin does, the EU follows. So I think this is all going to end. And in the meantime, we have a lot of people inside the Beltway chasing Care Bears and unicorns in a universe that doesn't exist. This fanciful world of the liberal whatever it is, democratic order that all these rules and regulations that we say other people should obey, but we ourselves ignore. It's over. That world has ended. We live in a multipolar environment now. Regions will become more and more important and dominant. And we have to conduct ourselves differently in the future, which I think is what most of us are talking about in any case. I just think it's going to happen not because of any sort of deliberate effort in Washington, as you've pointed out. It's going to happen because we can't afford to do much else. And all the problems we have at home, which are very severe, much more severe than anybody in Washington cares to admit publicly. So with that, unfortunately, I have to go. And I appreciate very much having been part of this. And I wish you all well. See you around campus.
Thank you very much, Douglas. On that score, I mean, we all had a good laugh, or at least my friends and I had a good laugh seeing some of the news, for example, about the carve-outs that the different European countries are already asking for. Belgium wants carve-outs for diamonds, Italy wants carve-outs for luxury handbags on any sanctions that will go forward. But even beyond that, Adam Tooze had a great piece yesterday, I think. He basically said even the banking sanctions are going to create carve-outs for energy. They're just not going, they're not going to be prepared to crack down on any of the money flows associated with energy, which is basically all of it, everything that matters. So is this the end of sanctions as a meaningful or even rhetorical tool in U.S. foreign policy? Are we finally admitting maybe that sanctions don't work, or are we still pretending otherwise?
David, you gave the game away. I thought you were admitting that you were suggesting that this is to admit that something that once worked now doesn't work any longer, except the number of instances in which sanctions have actually worked is actually quite rare. No, I think that the exceptions made to the sanctions instituted so far do speak to the fact that there is a certain amount of pain that the sanctioning countries are willing to endure in order to punish the Russians for their aggression against Ukraine. But beyond a certain level of pain, they are not willing to endure this. And I think that's the critical point. But I will say this, and I think there's actually a lesson from some of the other sanctions regimes that have actually been more effective than sometimes we admit. We've seen some steps taken by the World Cup, the Formula One racing, various other sports leagues and things to punish either team owners or to punish Russia itself for canceling events being held in Russia. This is not in a coordinated, formal way. This is not instituted by governments or anything like that. Watch this space. It's actually maybe more effective than we might imagine, that the people simply don't wish to be associated personally, professionally, not because the state compels them to do so, but because they don't like the image of being in league with a country that is waging a brutal war on its neighbor.
Something you said there, Chris, is exactly right. It's the big success of international sanctions in the last generation was South Africa, getting them to reform the apartheid system. And I've thought for years, and I've been seeing some things on it recently that, just knowing some South African folks that, believe it or not, these sanctions on South African sports were more important for public opinion in South Africa than their economy. You can rally around the flag when sanctions come on, and it sometimes helps the home regime. But in this world, especially South Africa's sports crazy, when they couldn't participate in the rugby World Cup, when they couldn't send the soccer team out, that hit people in a more visceral way. If the IOC would finally decide, the Russians maybe shouldn't be participating anymore. Unfortunately, we have to wait a while on that one. But if they can't send a team to Qatar, for the World Cup. That's going to get them to stand up and pay attention in a way that Putin's not going to be able to blame it as on the United States.
I have some bad news for you, gentlemen, which is that you just both made an argument on behalf of soft power. We'll have to have a moment of silence now, I'm afraid.
Why is that bad news, David? This is what? I'm smiling. This should be a good thing.
No, I'm kidding. I mean, but I guess I thought we were all realists here. But no, I mean, it suggests, but that certainly at least suggests that if sanctions and the idea of deprivation are in fact an overrated tool, it suggests that there's an underutilized tool in our kit, namely around, well, are we talking about norms, or we should be talking about a kind of social acceptability that, certain countries are still able to confer, and that perhaps we're not leaning on hard enough.
Well, just to comment on this, the Russians, when they hear things like what President Biden said yesterday, and he said, who in the world gave the Russians the right to invade a foreign country and declare some new country on the map just because they wanted to? The Russians look at that and they say, well, you did, United States. We saw what you did in Yugoslavia. We saw what happened when you decided that the Yugoslav government was abusing its own people. You intervened militarily. You did it without a UN Security Council authorization. You declared Kosovo an independent state. Who gave you that right, and what is the limiting principle there that says that you won't do that here in Russia? And I think Putin's answer to that is, well, the answer to that is the Russian military. The Russian military is what ensures that the United States and NATO won't do that kind of thing inside Russia or in Russia's neighborhood. To think that on an issue like that, the Russian people would be swayed by not being able to send a soccer team to the World Cup, I think is probably a little bit unrealistic. There is still a role for hard power in the world, and we have bumped into that, I think, in a unwise fashion. Many years ago, when we were first talking about the possibility of NATO enlargement, a number of people said it would be very unwise to push up to Russia's borders. The notion in the early 1990s that we would bring Ukraine, of all places, into the NATO alliance was absolutely unthinkable to people with any sort of knowledge of that part of the world. And yet we now have convinced ourselves that this is, normal and reasonable, and nobody should be objecting to this idea. It's quite startling to see the transformation. That's, again, not to excuse the resort to war on Putin's part of the way they're doing this. Not at all. It didn't have to be this way, and Putin ensured that it did. But we all, I think, walked into a situation that we should have foreseen was a real danger.
So I want to widen out a bit, and also go back to something that one of the Chris's raised, which is a very interesting New York Times article about the Biden overtures to China. And one of the things that came out in that article was that we were basically sharing intelligence with China, that is, which probably got passed on to Russia, even as the PRC basically, stonewalled and said, "Hey, what are you guys talking about? This isn't going to happen." That looks like, in retrospect, a blunder, although probably not a major one in the grand scheme of the situation. But it speaks to what I think is maybe a failure of grand strategy. All of you three have written on grand strategy, I know, and it suggests that we haven't. Does it suggest that we haven't yet begun to think about, in a holistic way or a comprehensive way, about the relationship of Europe and Asia, about our interest in how to sort of coordinate the one with the other, in that what we do in area X impacts area Y and vice versa, but then also in the ways that each of these other countries have their own interests or lack thereof in the situations that we care about. I guess what I'm saying is are we beginning to see a formulation? Is this going to push us to see a formulation of grand strategy? Do we need to have a grand strategy if we're going to go forward in moments like this?
Well, I certainly think you need a grand strategy to set priorities, to identify, as George said at the outset, our core national interests, to acknowledge and take account of other countries' core national interests, determine those places where they conflict or where they can be deconflicted. Often they can be, not always, but often. But this goes back to the very beginning of our conversation. If you believe that the United States is the reason why there's global peace in the world, if that's your belief, and there are many people that do, then you can't choose. You can't pivot. You can't make, you can't say one region is the responsibility of someone other than the United States. You have this vision of conception of the United States as being responsible for all this peace and security. Now, again, I think that's a defensible proposition after World War II, when the world was completely destroyed and the United States accounted for close to half of global output. But that's not a reasonable proposition any longer. And so I do think that in the case of Europe, that European states are going to have to take greater responsibility for their own security. That's something that people have spoken of for some time. It hasn't yet happened. And in Asia, I think it means the United States is also going to have to take account of the views of countries in that region, many of whom are really trying to avoid a confrontation, trying to pull the United States back from confrontation with China. So listen to other countries in the region who wish to maintain good relations with both the United States and China. So that's how I would respond to that. I do think that setting priorities is critical. I think we've all talked about this. The decision to finally, belatedly liquidate the U.S. mission in Afghanistan was painful but correct. I think the United States should draw down forces in the Middle East. I've written about that. Others have as well. But ultimately, I think in the case of the current crisis in Europe, it's a critical moment for the European countries to determine what they're prepared to do to defend their security, and not wait for the United States to show them the way or to dictate to them how this will be done.
I agree. At its heart, grand strategy is rooted in the recognition that there are limits to what we're able to do in the world. There are limits to what can be accomplished. There are limits to the resources that we have. There are limits to our wisdom in knowing what to do. And that dictates that you set priorities, that you decide what's most important. What do you have to do? And proceed on that basis. The United States is not accustomed to thinking that way. There was a time many decades ago when we were, but we no longer are. And if you look at our national strategy documents over the past several decades, there's no sense whatsoever that we have to even think about prioritization. There's no sense that there's any limits to what we can accomplish in the world. These are simply shopping lists. They simply say, we're going to do this, and we're going to do that, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. And there's no plan within them for matching those ambitions to actual resources and capabilities. We simply say, hey, we're going to do this, and magically it's supposed to happen. Well, if you compare those strategy documents over the past several decades to what we actually accomplished, you realize our real life accomplishments have fallen immensely short of what we said we were going to do. Now, what that means, I think, is there will be a time of reckoning, and I think we're close to facing that time. And it's not just the realization on the part of a lot of Americans that we have failed to accomplish the things that we've said we're going to do. There's also the national debt, which has gotten so enormous that it will inevitably at some point impose limits on what we can realistically hope to accomplish on all of this. The question is, do we wake up to that consciously before it happens, or do things simply collapse? And I hope it's the former rather than the latter.
This is a distressing amount of agreement, I have to say. But I don't disagree with any of the ways you guys have described grand strategy. But I mean, if it comes down to something, it seems to be concretely about knowing what you want, and making choices thereby. Elbridge Colby, for example, has been arguing that we have to focus on Asia, and this means making hard choices. We should want to worry, in other words, about interest in Asia, and above all, the rise of China as a strategic competitor. Can you guys, do we have any sense that the Biden administration concretely knows what it wants, even if it hasn't yet kind of sketched out a path to get there? And if not, what would you tell them if you were the prince in this case? What would you tell them that they should want in concrete terms?
With respect to China, David, or more? I'm sorry, Chris. Go ahead. Chris,
No, go ahead. Go ahead. That's what I was wondering too. Do you have,
well, yeah, do you mean in general, David, or are you mostly now referring to relations with China?
No, I mean in general. I mean Colby's answer would be our biggest concern should be the rise of China, and then everything else flows from that and has to be organized around that recognition. You can agree with that, but if not, is there something else that ultimately has to be considered the priority that then dictates the order of concern? And
well, all I would say is, with respect to, I will speak to them with respect to China, because the administration recently issued their Indo-Pacific strategy, and there's a big hole in the middle of it, which is China. It talks about all our U.S. allies and partners, but the China component of it is mostly dealt with as though China were a foreign body, not part of the Indo-Pacific. And I think it's really problematic. No, the challenge for the U.S.-China relationship is unless we are prepared to decouple economically completely, not around the margins, not stop buying Barbies and toys and clothing, right? An actual economic decoupling, and expect U.S. allies and partners to do the same. Unless we expect that's going to happen, then I don't think it's realistic to think that the United States confrontation with China will eventually end with the United States prevailing and China being defeated. I don't think that's how it's going to play out. So what that means is the two countries, the United States and China, the two leading economic powers in the world, and will be for the foreseeable future, need to figure out a way to get along with one another. And that's the ultimate truth. And if you're not prepared for that, if that doesn't sit well with you, if you're not content with the idea of the United States and China will both exist more or less as they do 50 or 100 years from now, then you need to be on a much more specific and urgent mission to decouple the United States and the rest of the global economy from China. And I'm all ears for how you go about doing that, because I just don't think it's practical. I don't think it's
I would agree completely with Chris. And if I were advising the president, I would tell him to go back to his instincts in the last 10 years or so, when he had said many of the things that Chris was sort of saying. That you say that China doesn't have to be a rival, that their growth is not necessarily a threat to us. But he stopped saying that, I think, largely because that's unsellable in our current political environment. Trump has made Trump made China the enormous boogeyman, and one of his many scapegoats was the Chinese, and it convinced a lot of people that you don't pay a price for being too hawkish on China right now. You pay a price for the opposite, and it's going to be totally counterproductive. Another thing. The president should not listen to Elbridge Colby. He just shut those people out. The most basic tenet of our grand strategy ought to be keeping China and Russia apart. Don't let them coordinate their policies. And you don't do that by being a hawk on every single issue. Changing our focus from the Pacific to the Indo-Pacific is just with China. And it's an example of stupidity. What are we doing? We're just pushing China away from us and making them feel like the enemy. If we treat China like an enemy, we're going to get an enemy, and it's not that simple. They get choices too. But the president's instincts on this were better 5 years ago, before the Trump era made China into the boogeyman. He should return to his basic, what it seems to me, more realist instincts.
Well, let me offer a little bit of disagreement on this. I think that the Biden administration has articulated a grand strategy, one that I don't think makes much sense, but nonetheless, I think it's there. And it is dividing the world essentially into authoritarian and democratic blocs. Fundamentally, Biden is sketching out the challenge before us as facing authoritarian states, Russia and China being the foremost among them, that by their very nature represent a threat to freedom and democracy. And that the peace-loving, freedom-loving, democratic countries of the world need to unite under American leadership to face against this threat that Russia and China represent to us. It's fundamentally an ideological vision. I think it's actually a caricature of the threat that we're facing. I think it is counterproductive in that it encourages greater Russian-Chinese cooperation against us in the world, complicating our geostrategic outlook, making our ability to deal with the rise of China, which I do think is our fundamental geopolitical challenge, although I don't agree with Elbridge Colby about the way he prescribes who how to deal with it. It makes it much more difficult than it would otherwise be. And it makes little sense to me to pursue what we've been pursuing, which is essentially a policy of dual hostility toward Moscow and Beijing. I do think there's a role for military force and preparedness in dealing with the Chinese, although I think it is a mistake to militarize that relationship to the degree that some are advocating, because it is not fundamentally a military challenge. And I do think we need to be much more cautious about the issue of Taiwan. And what we have essentially been doing is eroding some of the fundamental understandings that we had reached with the People's Republic at the time that we opened relations with them. And in questioning those agreements, as we are now doing, we are alarming the Chinese and actually creating what might become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we're almost incentivizing the Chinese to take action against Taiwan that I don't think they would undertake under different circumstances, at least not as quickly as they might otherwise. And I think all of that is a mistake. But is the growth of China in the world a problem for the United States that we have to manage and manage wisely? Yes, it is. And one of the things that I think we assumed, again, back in the 1990s, was that greater integration of China into the world economy, more outsourcing of manufacturing, greater entanglement, integration of U.S. production and the Chinese economy itself would bring not just prosperity to China, but actually encourage the growth of the middle class and greater liberalization that would flow from all of that. And they would become, essentially more like us over time. I think the verdict is in on that, and it was unsuccessful. That assumption was not correct. The Chinese did not become more like us, more liberal in their governance as a result of that growing prosperity. Instead, they've become more mercantilist. They have wielded their economic might in the world in ways that actually are not in the American interest. And I think actually the American economy has suffered under all of this as well. Now, I agree with Chris that, simply decoupling the US and Chinese economies would be disastrous. I think it would kill both of us, economically speaking, and not something that we should undertake right now. But we also have to manage this in a way that doesn't cause even worse problems than what we're experiencing right now. I've not heard very many people in positions of responsibility articulate to me persuasive ways of doing that. I think we have to do some real thinking on all of this. We don't have a template for how to do this right now.
Well, that may be as good a note to end on as any, particularly because George actually took my last question out of my mouth, which is, is there a Biden doctrine? And his answer seems to be yes, and it's not very good. So we will see what the next 3 years brings. But I do want to thank all of our panelists as well as our listeners for joining. This was an excellent discussion. Despite all the agreement, I thought the agreement mostly converged on sensible and prudent points, as well as it should. So thank you all. And hopefully we'll see you at our next panel.
Thank you, David. Thank you all.